It was a clear morning on the north side of Lake Tahoe, the kind of day when the water looks almost glassy and the air feels crisp enough to sting. Families often came here for picnics, for fishing, for long walks that ended with sunburn and sore legs. Rachel Moore was one of them. She was 28 years old, a young mother trying to balance exhaustion and joy in equal measure. That morning, she had packed a small bag with sandwiches, juice boxes, and a blanket, buckled her 3-year-old son, Daniel, into the back seat, and driven the short distance from her rental cabin to the trailhead. Witnesses would later remember her car pulling into the gravel lot around 10 o'clock. A silver sedan, nothing unusual, parked neatly between two larger trucks. Rachel wasn't the sort of person who made a scene, but people remembered her anyway. Maybe because she had a way of standing slightly apart, watching her son with a quiet patience. Daniel, like most toddlers, didn't walk so much as dart. Small sneakers crunching against gravel, he ran toward the shoreline with the kind of reckless energy only a 3-year-old can manage. By late morning, several hikers recalled passing them along the path. A young woman crouched near the edge of the water, helping her boy collect smooth stones. She wore a light jacket, her hair tied back. He wore a red sweatshirt, one that had a cartoon bear stitched across the chest. They waved as people went by. It seemed at the time like one of those small, fleeting images you barely register. But later, when those same hikers were called by detectives, every detail suddenly mattered. Rachel spread a blanket on the sand and unpacked the bag. She gave Daniel a juice box, and he sat for a rare moment poking at the straw. For a while, everything was calm. At one point, she took a photo on her phone, snapping a picture of him with the lake behind him. That photo, time-stamped, would become the last digital trace of them both. Around noon, one fisherman reported seeing the pair again. They were standing at the tree line, Rachel holding Daniel's hand as he tugged impatiently toward the water. The fisherman said she looked tired, but not distressed. He swore she smiled when Daniel broke free for a second and ran ahead, splashing at the shallows. It was an ordinary scene, the kind that played out along Tahoe every day. Nothing about it seemed urgent. Nothing suggested what would happen next. Hours later, when the sun dipped lower and the shadows lengthened across the water, Rachel's car still sat in the lot, but Rachel and Daniel were nowhere to be seen. A couple returning from a hike around 4 o'clock noticed the blanket still spread out on the sand, half covered with stones that had been carried from the water's edge. The bag she'd packed was there too, with the sandwiches untouched. Daniel's small shoes, though, were gone. So was Rachel. At first, people assumed they had simply wandered down another trail. Families often let children roam a little further than intended. But when dusk crept in, and there was still no sign of them, unease grew. A man who had seen them earlier in the day returned to the lot and realized the silver sedan was locked and unattended. He called it in. Within the hour, deputies from the county sheriff's office were on scene. Officers walked the shoreline, calling their names, shining flashlights into the trees as the light failed. They expected to hear a child's cry, the sound of movement, anything. But there was nothing. Just the quiet lap of water against the rocks, the wind pressing through the trees. It was as if the mother and her boy had been swallowed whole by the landscape. By nightfall, the picnic blanket was bagged as evidence. Deputies traced the small shoe prints leading toward the water, but found no return marks. Dogs were brought in, but lost the scent within minutes. The car was dusted, confirming Rachel had driven herself there and locked the doors after. There were no signs of a struggle, no dropped belongings, no broken branches in the brush. Friends tried to call her phone, but it rang from inside her purse, sitting in the passenger seat of the car. Her wallet was still there, along with her keys. Detectives would later say it looked less like someone preparing to leave and more like someone planning to come right back. By midnight, the search had expanded into the forest and across the shoreline. Boats fanned out over the water with high-powered spotlights. Officers knocked on nearby cabins, asking if anyone had seen a woman and a child in the last 12 hours. The answer was always the same. Yes, earlier. But now? No. The first 24 hours of any missing persons case are the most crucial. That night, authorities hoped they were simply dealing with a tired toddler and a mother who had wandered too far, perhaps disoriented. But the deeper they searched, the less sense it made. The shoreline was clear. The trails were clear. Helicopters using thermal imaging scanned the area. There was nothing to find. The official report filed that night described the disappearance as sudden and unexplainable. Detectives could only list the facts: a car, a blanket, a bag of food, a mother and child last seen playing at the water's edge. No witnesses saw them leave. No one saw them board a boat, walk into the woods, or head toward the road. They had simply vanished. By dawn, the search was escalated to a full emergency response. But even in those first hours, some investigators admitted privately that the silence felt wrong. Children don't just disappear without leaving a trail. Parents don't walk off without their phones, wallets, or keys. Something had happened in that gap of time after noon, something no one had seen, but everyone would soon be searching for. It was the beginning of a case that would haunt Lake Tahoe for years, because within that single day, Rachel Moore and her 3-year-old son Daniel had gone from a mother and child on a picnic to the center of one of the most chilling mysteries the area had ever known. The first morning of the search began with urgency. Deputies who had stayed overnight reported nothing: no sound of movement in the woods, no sign of footprints in the sand beyond those already documented. By sunrise, the area had been transformed. Sheriff's trucks, fire crews, and search and rescue volunteers filled the gravel lot where Rachel's sedan still sat locked, untouched, a silent anchor to the mystery. Search teams fanned out in every direction. Some swept along the shoreline, calling the names over and over: Rachel, Daniel. Others worked their way into the woods, leaving ribbons tied to branches to mark where they had searched. Helicopters thudded overhead, their spotlights slicing through the trees, while divers entered the water in thick wetsuits, sinking into the icy blue depths of Tahoe. From the start, investigators expected something. A piece of fabric caught on a branch, a trail of small footprints, the sound of a cry carried by wind. Toddlers don't vanish cleanly. They leave behind signs of panic, of movement, of stumbling. Yet hours passed and nothing surfaced. The sand near the waterline showed no additional impressions, no drag marks, no sign of someone slipping into the lake. Even the dogs brought in to track scent were left confused. They followed Rachel and Daniel's trail from the parking lot to the blanket, and then it ended. No continuation, no scatter, just silence. The divers worked for hours. Tahoe's waters are deceptively beautiful but treacherous, frigid, deep, and with currents that pull unpredictably. The theory of drowning seemed plausible in those early hours. Perhaps Rachel had gone in after Daniel, both of them overtaken by the cold shock. Yet divers found nothing: no floating clothing, no bodies, not even a trace of fabric clinging to rocks beneath the surface. The sonar scans came back empty. Detectives gathered at the shoreline to compare notes. One pointed out how unusual it was for a child to leave no trace at all. Children that age drop things constantly: sippy cups, shoes, toys, scraps of food. Yet nothing of Daniel's was missing except what he'd been wearing. Rachel's purse was still in the car, zipped neatly, wallet and phone inside. The ignition key lay in her jacket pocket, folded neatly on the passenger seat. It looked like a car someone had stepped out of for a moment, expecting to return. By the second day, the search grew wider. Volunteers on horseback combed the back trails. Kayaks paddled along shallow inlets. Helicopters equipped with thermal cameras swept the forest canopy at night, looking for the faint signature of body heat. But the images returned flat, just the cold stillness of rock, water, and pine. Every hour without discovery shifted the mood. What began as a rescue effort started to feel like the hunt for something worse. Detectives interviewed campers who had been in the area that weekend. Some remembered seeing Rachel and Daniel, though their stories blurred together. A few described Rachel as quiet, focused on her son. One man swore he saw them laughing near the water, but nothing beyond that. No one recalled screams, a struggle, or any sudden commotion. The more they compared statements, the more the timeline seemed to vanish into fog. By day 3, investigators faced a growing contradiction. If the pair had drowned, evidence should have surfaced. If they had walked into the woods, footprints or belongings should have been found. Yet both possibilities remained empty. Detectives began to whisper among themselves about abduction. Could someone have intercepted them, leading Rachel willingly away from the shoreline or forcing her at gunpoint? Theories began to form, but without physical evidence, they were only shadows. Rachel's family arrived from out of state, standing helplessly at the edge of the lot where her car sat. They watched the rescue boats returning again and again with nothing. Her sister pressed reporters to stop asking about domestic disputes, insisting Rachel had no enemies, no reason to walk away from her life. Still, detectives had to ask. They pulled phone records, checked bank activity, questioned Rachel's estranged partner. Nothing pointed to him, but the absence of leads only deepened suspicion everywhere. The lake kept its silence. Each night, search crews returned exhausted, their flashlights bobbing in the darkness. Locals began to stop by, bringing food for the volunteers, whispering about the strangeness of it all. Many had lived near Tahoe their entire lives, and most agreed on one thing. People don't just disappear here without a trace. Accidents happen, yes, but they leave wreckage behind. This left nothing. By the end of the week, the sheriff's office called it one of the most perplexing searches they had ever conducted. Hundreds of man-hours, divers, dogs, aircraft, yet no bodies, no belongings, no clue to anchor a theory. The official word to the press was, "Careful." The investigation remained open, all possibilities considered. But privately, detectives admitted unease. The lake, the woods, the trails. They had been scoured. Rachel and Daniel should have been found. And yet, they weren't. It was in that void that suspicion began to grow. Some began to whisper that this wasn't an accident, not a misstep into the water or a hike gone wrong. Something else had happened at the lake that day, something no search team could uncover. The silence wasn't just unsettling, it was starting to feel deliberate. In the weeks after the disappearance, the official search slowly pulled back, but the absence of answers created a vacuum that the community quickly filled with speculation. Around Lake Tahoe, people began to take sides, each convinced they knew what had really happened to Rachel and her little boy. For some, the explanation seemed painfully simple. They believed mother and child had drowned. Tahoe had claimed lives before, swimmers overtaken by sudden cramps, kayakers lost to cold shock. The water was notorious for keeping bodies preserved in its depths, never rising to the surface. Those who supported this theory pointed to the shoe prints that stopped at the shoreline, the lack of evidence in the woods, and the history of accidents in the lake. Rachel must have chased Daniel into the water, they said. Both were gone in an instant, but others were unconvinced. They argued that drowning victims eventually surface or leave behind clothing and personal effects. Divers had searched thoroughly, sonar had mapped the lake bed, and yet there was nothing. To them, the absence of evidence suggested something else. Abduction. Someone had been in the area that day, watching, waiting for the right moment. A stranger, or perhaps someone Rachel knew. They believed the blanket, the bag of food, the untouched car, all hinted at an interruption, a sudden intrusion that forced her to leave without her belongings. As the case stretched into its second week, whispers about Rachel's personal life began to creep into conversations. She had been separated from Daniel's father, a man who lived 2 towns over. Detectives quietly questioned him, aware that estranged partners are often suspects in missing persons cases. His alibi was airtight. He had been at work the entire day, confirmed by multiple co-workers and time-stamped records. Investigators could not place him near the lake, yet rumors persisted. People speculated he might have hired someone or orchestrated something out of sight. Though detectives publicly cleared him, the community kept his name in circulation. With each passing day, more theories took shape, and the town fractured under the weight of its own suspicion. Some believed Rachel had staged the disappearance herself. Overwhelmed by the pressures of motherhood, she may have walked away intentionally. This idea spread through online forums and gossip columns, though her family vehemently denied it. They insisted Rachel adored Daniel, that she was planning his birthday party, that she had no reason to vanish. Still, the rumor was there, feeding the growing narrative that no one really knew what Rachel might have been capable of. By the 3rd week, the tabloids arrived. Outlets from across the country set up cameras near the lake, interviewing anyone willing to speak. Stories circulated about cults rumored to gather in the forest, about human traffickers who targeted young mothers traveling alone, about strange men seen hitchhiking near the trailheads. Each new angle drew more attention, more fear, more suspicion. For the locals who had lived quietly around Tahoe for decades, it was a shock to see their home turned into the centerpiece of national speculation. Detectives, meanwhile, tried to hold the line. They issued careful statements, repeating that all possibilities remained under investigation. But privately, they admitted the lack of evidence left them chasing shadows. Every theory sounded possible, yet none had proof. The case reports began to read like competing stories. An accident in the lake, an abduction in the woods, a voluntary disappearance into nowhere. Each scenario explained one piece, but left others hanging. Within the town itself, neighbors began to argue. Some accused the police of incompetence, saying vital evidence must have been missed. Others criticized the family for not revealing enough about Rachel's private life. Friendships frayed as gossip replaced facts, and the community grew increasingly divided. Rachel's sister, speaking at a small candlelight vigil, begged people to stop speculating and start remembering the reality. A young woman and her toddler were gone, but her words struggled to break through the noise. By the end of the first month, the search area had been cleared, the volunteers had gone home, and the sheriff's office had scaled back operations. What remained was not clarity, but division. A mother and her son had disappeared on a bright afternoon by the lake, and in their absence, the town had turned on itself. No one knew which version of events was true. What they did know was that silence had created a breeding ground for theories, and every day without answers pushed those theories further from each other, fracturing the community that once hoped to find them. It was nearly 6 weeks after Rachel and Daniel had vanished when the first real development emerged. By then, the official search had scaled back. The helicopters were gone, the volunteers had returned home, and only a skeleton crew of detectives remained assigned to the case. The woods around Lake Tahoe had grown quiet again, as if nature had erased the chaos of those first frantic days. But on a Saturday morning in late June, a small group of volunteer hikers combing a trail nearly 4 miles from the lake stumbled on something that stopped them cold. The hikers had been moving through a dense section of pine, an area choked with brush where few casual visitors ever wandered. Tucked beneath a fallen log, half hidden by leaves and dirt, was a small white sock. It was tiny, no larger than a man's palm, the kind only a toddler would wear. At first, the group assumed it was just litter, the kind of thing dropped by a family months earlier. But something about it felt wrong. It was too clean in places, too preserved. And just beside it, snagged on the bark of the log, was a scrap of faded fabric, blue with faint cartoon shapes still visible. The hikers turned the items over to the sheriff's office that afternoon. Detectives immediately recognized the description. Weeks earlier, Rachel's sister had given a detailed account of what Daniel had been wearing that day: a red sweatshirt, dark pants, and small white socks with blue stitching along the top. Forensic technicians compared the fibers and confirmed within days that the sock belonged to Daniel. The fabric scrap, torn from a blanket, also matched a set Rachel had carried for him on outings. The discovery reignited the case. After weeks of silence, there was finally something tangible. Physical proof the boy had been there, yet the location posed more questions than it answered. The site was nearly 4 miles from where Rachel's car had been parked, over terrain far too rough for a toddler to cover on his own. Detectives ruled out the possibility that Daniel had simply wandered that far, especially in the thick brush. It meant one of two things. Either Rachel had carried him there, or someone else had. Investigators returned to the area with search teams, sweeping every inch of ground surrounding the discovery. They expected, perhaps even hoped, to find more. Shoes, toys, clothing, anything. But nothing else appeared. The sock and blanket fragment were isolated, like an incomplete puzzle piece dropped in the middle of nowhere. Theories multiplied again. Some detectives believed Rachel may have fled into the forest with Daniel, possibly chased or threatened. They argued she could have dropped the items accidentally during a hurried escape. But others believed the objects had been placed deliberately, perhaps even planted later to mislead the search. The fabric looked weathered, but not as degraded as expected for items left in the elements for over a month. It suggested to some that they hadn't been there the entire time. Locals seized on the development with renewed energy. Newspapers ran headlines about the forest clue, and television crews returned to Tahoe, eager to film near the trail. Theories about abduction gained traction again. If someone had taken Rachel and Daniel, this discovery might have been the first breadcrumb, a sign of movement away from the lake. Parents in the area grew more fearful, warning their children not to walk alone, convinced a predator might still be out there. Rachel's family was torn. Her sister clung to the discovery as proof they were still alive when they left the lake. She argued that if Daniel's belongings had made it that far, it meant someone had been caring for him, moving him. But Rachel's parents, weary from weeks of dashed hopes, worried it meant something darker, that the items had been discarded after the worst had already happened. Detectives tried to trace the area for signs of campsites or vehicle access. The trail was narrow, remote, but not impossible to reach by foot. What struck them most was how intentional the placement seemed. The sock wasn't buried or destroyed. It was left where someone might find it, almost like a marker. But without more evidence, they could not prove intent. Forensic testing on the items yielded no foreign DNA, no fingerprints, no trace evidence to point toward another person. The sock and blanket were Daniel's undeniably, but they offered nothing about who had brought them there or when. The sheriff's office announced the findings publicly, calling it a significant development, though privately detectives admitted it left them with more questions than answers. Had Rachel carried her son deep into the woods? Had someone abducted them both and dropped the belongings while moving? Or had a third party placed them there long after the disappearance, cruelly feeding the mystery? The discovery electrified the case, but also fractured it further. Theories once whispered grew louder. Families debated whether the find offered hope or confirmed tragedy. The community, already raw with speculation, found itself pulled in even sharper directions. What was undeniable was that the items did not belong where they were found. They represented movement, intervention, something beyond a simple drowning in the lake. For the first time, detectives felt certain that someone else's hand had touched this case. But whose hand, and whether it had been meant to help or to hide, remained the unanswered question that now consumed them. The discovery of Daniel's sock and blanket fragment had pulled the investigation back into focus, but it also created pressure. Detectives needed answers, and quickly. They began re-interviewing anyone who had been near the lake that day, hoping overlooked details might suddenly matter. In doing so, they uncovered stories that complicated everything further. One of the most striking came from a fisherman who had been casting off a rocky point on the eastern side of the lake. He had spoken with deputies early in the investigation, but at the time offered little more than a vague recollection of seeing a young woman and child along the tree line. Now, weeks later, his memory had sharpened, or perhaps shifted. He insisted that when he saw the pair, they were not alone. He described a man walking a few paces behind them, close enough to seem connected, far enough not to touch. The fisherman claimed the man was older, maybe in his 40s, wearing a dark jacket despite the warmth of the afternoon. He said Rachel had glanced over her shoulder several times, her expression unreadable. At the time, he hadn't thought much of it, but in light of the disappearance, he was convinced the presence of that man had to mean something. Detectives pressed for details. Could he describe the man's face, his height? Did he carry anything? The fisherman shook his head. The memory was already blurred by distance, the details vague. He couldn't even say if the man spoke to Rachel or if they walked together intentionally. What he remembered most was the image of a small boy tugging at his mother's hand while an unfamiliar figure trailed behind them. That same week, a hiker came forward with a different account. He had been traveling a side trail above the shoreline in the mid-afternoon when he thought he heard something faint drifting through the trees. At first, he assumed it was just another family, but the sound unsettled him. It was the high-pitched, drawn-out cry of a child. He paused, listening. But by the time he reached the clearing, the sound had faded. He saw no one, only the water glittering below. The memory lingered with him for weeks, and after hearing news of the belongings found in the woods, he felt compelled to report it. Detectives considered both accounts carefully. If the fisherman's recollection was accurate, then Rachel and Daniel may have left the lake in the company of an unknown man. If the hiker's memory was correct, Daniel may have still been alive hours later, somewhere deeper in the forest. Both scenarios clashed with the working theories investigators had been building. The trouble was reliability. Memory, especially weeks after the fact, can shift in subtle ways. Detectives knew that once the media storm broke, witnesses often unconsciously blended details from news reports with their own recollections. The fisherman might have seen nothing more than a passer-by, later recast in his mind as significant. The hiker could have mistaken the sound of a bird or the echo of another family far down the trail. Each insisted on the truth of what they had experienced, but neither account could be verified. To pursue the leads, detectives canvassed the area again. They pulled visitor logs, checked nearby cabins, and reviewed any surveillance cameras on the roads leading away from the park. Nothing surfaced. No one matched the description of the older man. No other hikers reported a crying child. The accounts stood alone, tantalizing but uncorroborated. Rachel's family clung to the possibility. Her sister argued the sightings proved she and Daniel had not simply drowned, that they had been alive beyond the lake's edge. But others cautioned against drawing hope from unstable ground. Detectives had learned long ago that eyewitness testimony, while compelling, was among the most fragile forms of evidence. Without physical proof, it was little more than shadow. In the community, the stories took on a life of their own. Some insisted the fisherman's mystery man was the abductor, circling them like a predator before striking. Others believed the crying child was a haunting echo, proof that Daniel had suffered somewhere in the woods. Rumors circulated about strangers camping in the area that week, about vehicles parked along fire roads, about men no one could name who had been seen drifting near trailheads. None of it solidified into fact. For detectives, the accounts were both a gift and a curse. They reopened avenues of investigation, but also muddled the timeline. If Rachel and Daniel had been alive near the tree line, then the theory of drowning collapsed. If a crying child had been heard later, then the belongings found in the woods might mark a route, not a misdirection. But without corroboration, each story was a thread leading nowhere, tangling the narrative instead of clarifying it. Weeks turned into months, and the accounts slipped quietly into the case files, marked as unverified. They remained there, small bursts of possibility overshadowed by the larger void of evidence. But for those who had heard them, they left an indelible impression, the idea that somewhere between shoreline and forest, someone else might have been there, someone who changed the trajectory of Rachel and Daniel's lives forever. And if that were true, then what had happened at Lake Tahoe was not an accident of nature, but the work of another person, someone who, to this day, has never been identified. Rachel's family had remained mostly silent during the early days of the investigation, speaking only through brief statements and candlelight vigils. But as the weeks dragged into months and speculation tore through the community, they began to step forward, hoping to reclaim control of the narrative. At a press conference outside the sheriff's office, her sister Claire spoke carefully into the microphones. Rachel was overwhelmed, yes, she admitted, but never reckless. She adored her son. She would never put him in danger, never just walk away. Her words were steady, but her face betrayed the exhaustion of a woman pulled thin by grief and suspicion. The press latched on immediately. Reporters asked if Rachel had ever mentioned being followed or if she struggled with mental health. Claire shook her head, insisting her sister was private but strong, a woman who carried more on her shoulders than she let anyone see. Yet the statement did little to settle the growing storm. By then, rumors had already spread across town and online forums, whispers of secret relationships, financial troubles, even talk of her planning to start over somewhere else. Detectives, too, had begun to probe more deeply into Rachel's personal life. They gained access to her phone records, sifting through calls and texts from the weeks leading up to her disappearance. One thread caught their attention, a series of short, vague messages exchanged with an unknown number. The tone was friendly, familiar, but cautious. In one, Rachel wrote, "I'll see you when I get there." In another, "Can't talk long, just Daniel and me." The final text, sent the morning she vanished, read simply, "At the lake now." Detectives traced the number, but it was prepaid, registered under no name, and quickly deactivated after her disappearance. They combed through bank accounts and credit cards, looking for unusual purchases that might tie Rachel to someone new. They found nothing concrete, no hotel stays, no large withdrawals, no sign of a double life. Yet the shadow of those texts lingered, Whoever she had been speaking to had vanished as cleanly as she had. Her family grew defensive under the scrutiny. Claire insisted the messages had to be innocent, maybe a friend Rachel didn't want judged. But investigators pressed, wondering aloud if Rachel had been meeting someone at the lake that day. If so, why keep it secret? Why not tell her family, her friends, anyone? The implication unsettled them, that Rachel may have trusted the wrong person, or worse, that she had been lured into danger by someone she thought she knew. As detectives chased the possibility, tension within the family deepened. Rachel's parents blamed law enforcement for leaking too much to the press. They accused reporters of twisting their daughter's life into scandal. Meanwhile, Claire found herself battling online strangers who dissected Rachel's choices in forums and comment threads. Some claimed Rachel had staged her disappearance. Others painted her as irresponsible, a mother unfit to care for a child. For a family already raw with grief, the judgment was unbearable. Behind closed doors, fractures widened. Arguments broke out about how much to share with investigators. Some family members believed complete transparency was the only way forward. Others feared releasing too much would only feed speculation. The once unified front began to splinter under the pressure of scrutiny. Detectives, sensing hesitation, pushed harder. They subpoenaed emails, searched for dating app accounts, combed through work records. They found no affair, no hidden plan to disappear, no sudden purchases that suggested a new life waiting elsewhere. But the silence left a different kind of weight. Each lead that dissolved into nothingness left only more pressure to find the one that wouldn't. The family tried to hold on to Rachel's image as they knew her, a young mother doing her best, someone who laughed at small things, someone who would never leave Daniel behind. But as weeks stretched into months, they couldn't escape the gnawing reality that secrets were now tied to her name, secrets that Rachel never had the chance to explain. By the end of that summer, the case was no closer to resolution. The mysterious text messages remained a ghost lead, taunting investigators with the possibility of someone who had been there, unseen. The family was left to fend off whispers that only grew louder with time. For them, grief became inseparable from suspicion. Every time her sister defended Rachel publicly, another rumor took root. The weight of unanswered questions didn't just haunt the investigators. It fractured the very people who loved Rachel most, leaving them divided, exhausted, and still with no idea who or what had taken her and Daniel away. By the end of that first year, the investigation had slowed to a crawl. What had begun with helicopters overhead and divers scouring the depths of the lake was now little more than a desk stacked with reports in the sheriff's office. The daily press briefings stopped. The search teams packed up their gear. Rachel and Daniel's disappearance was no longer treated as an emergency. It had become a mystery, one without momentum. The seasons around Tahoe moved forward in their quiet rhythm. Winter set in, freezing the lake into a sheet of pale glass. Spring thawed it again, tourists returned, and summer brought back families to the same beaches where Rachel had once spread her blanket. The cycle repeated year after year while the case sat unchanged. Detectives rotated out. Some retired, others were reassigned. Each left behind neatly filed notes, theories written in the margins, maps marked with X's. But none of it added up to more than what they had had on the first night: a car, a blanket, a purse, and two people who were simply gone. The case became a teaching story for rookies, an example of how silence can smother even the best efforts. Yet, the mystery never disappeared completely. Hunters moving through the backcountry would sometimes report strange sounds at dusk. A faint child's cry carried on the wind, so brief they wondered if they had imagined it. Others claimed to stumble on small objects: a toy car in the dirt, a pacifier lodged between rocks. Each time, deputies collected the items, sending them to labs. Each time, the results came back the same: no connection to Rachel or Daniel. But the stories spread anyway. Locals began to talk of the lake and the woods in hushed tones, as if something haunted the place. Parents warned their children not to wander near the tree line. Hikers admitted they avoided certain trails after dark. The absence of closure bred superstition, and superstition kept the case alive in a way the official investigation no longer could. Rachel's family endured the years in a kind of suspended grief. They held vigils on the anniversaries, their candles flickering against the lake's dark surface. At each gathering, someone would step forward to speak, a sister, a cousin, a childhood friend, each saying the same thing, that Rachel had loved her son too much to walk away, that someone must have taken them. But as the years stretched on, fewer people came. The vigils grew smaller, quieter, until eventually they were attended only by a handful of relatives and neighbors. For the detectives who had once chased the case, the lack of progress was hard to swallow. They had chased leads across state lines, followed tips from psychics and strangers, knocked on the doors of men with records. Nothing ever stuck. Over time, the case file grew thick with false hope. The sheriff's office eventually designated it as inactive, though not closed. That distinction mattered little to the family. For them, it was confirmation of what they already knew. The system had no answers left to give. Still, the whispers never stopped. In local diners and grocery store aisles, people traded theories like currency. Some clung to the belief Rachel had drowned, her body trapped in the cold depths where light never reaches. Others were sure she had been taken. The Daniel sock in the forest was proof of a path never properly followed. Some even believed Rachel had staged it, that she had stepped away from her life by choice. Each version of the story was told with certainty, as though speaking it enough times could make it true. But the truth never surfaced. By the 5th year, Rachel's car had been returned to her parents. It sat in their driveway, unused, a ghost of the last day she'd been seen. Daniel's room remained untouched in their home, his toys lined neatly on a shelf, waiting for a child who would never play with them again. The town carried on. Tourists came and went, families made memories on the same beaches, and the lake kept its silence. But for those who lived there year-round, the case lingered like a shadow. The mother and toddler, who had vanished without a trace, were never far from mind. Their absence had carved something into the landscape itself, something that no thaw, no summer, no passing year could erase. Rachel and Daniel Moore had been gone for years, and still there was nothing. No evidence, no confession, no body. Just the quiet certainty that somewhere between the lake and the woods, something had happened that no one could explain. And until that truth was uncovered, the case would remain exactly as it had started, a mystery that refused to let go. 8 years had passed since Rachel and Daniel vanished, and by then their story had faded into something closer to legend. New families had moved to Tahoe, new headlines had replaced the old, and only those who had lived through the initial chaos still carried the weight of the disappearance with them. The sheriff's office still kept the case file open, but it hadn't been touched in years. Then, in the summer of the 8th year, nature itself delivered something no one expected. That year, the lake had fallen to levels not seen in generations. A severe drought gripped the region, draining Tahoe's vast basin until familiar shorelines looked unfamiliar. Beaches stretched further, docks sat awkwardly above dry earth, and stretches of mud appeared where clear water had always been. Locals grumbled about lost tourism dollars, about boat ramps that no longer reached the water, but for others, the change revealed something hidden. In late August, 2 hikers following the new shoreline near a secluded cove noticed the glint of metal poking from the muck. At first, they thought it was just debris exposed by the drought, a rusted tin or old camping gear left behind years ago. But as they scraped away at the caked mud, the object took shape. A small, battered lunchbox. Its paint was nearly gone, rust spread across its surface, but the faint outline of cartoon figures could still be made out. Curiosity turned to unease when they forced it open. Inside was a jumble of degraded items, scraps of paper too far gone to read, the broken remains of a plastic fork, and, most chilling of all, a toddler's sippy cup. The plastic was discolored, warped with age, but the faded design was still visible. Investigators would later confirm what the hikers suspected in that moment. It had belonged to 3-year-old Daniel Moore. The discovery electrified the town. After nearly a decade of silence, here was proof that something of Rachel and Daniel's had remained in the lake all along. The lunchbox was photographed, sealed, and rushed to the state lab for analysis. Forensic specialists compared the items with photos provided by Rachel's family from before the disappearance. The match was undeniable. The cup had been Daniel's, part of a set Rachel kept in her car. Theories reignited overnight. If the lunchbox had been in the lake all this time, did that mean Rachel and Daniel had drowned there after all? Had investigators been wrong to chase the theories of abduction, of escape into the woods? Reporters once again crowded into Tahoe, standing at the same shoreline they had broadcasted from 8 years earlier. For a town that had long since grown used to silence, the noise returned in an instant. Detectives reopened the case, reviewing old maps of the lake and comparing them to the newly exposed shoreline. The lunchbox had been found in shallow mud, a section normally underwater. They considered the possibility it had been dropped accidentally the day of the disappearance. But the condition of the box told a more complicated story. The metal was heavily rusted, yes, but the items inside were remarkably preserved for something supposedly submerged for years. Specialists suggested it might not have been underwater the entire time. Perhaps it had been buried in silt, protected from the elements, only to be revealed now. The placement also made little sense. Rachel and Daniel had last been seen on the opposite side of the lake, nearly 3 miles away. How had the lunchbox ended up here? Could it have drifted with currents, or had someone moved it deliberately? Investigators debated the possibilities, none of which sat comfortably. For Rachel's family, the discovery was devastating. Her sister Claire said the sight of the sippy cup broke her twice, once for the child who had carried it, and again for the years lost to not knowing. To her, the lunchbox was proof they had been there, but not proof of what had happened. "It's like he's still reaching out to us," she said in an interview, "but the rest of the picture is gone." Detectives ordered a new round of searches along the exposed shoreline. Cadaver dogs were brought in, sniffing the mud for any trace of human remains. Ground-penetrating radar scanned for anomalies. Teams dug shallow trenches near where the lunchbox had been found, but day after day, the results came back the same. Nothing. Not a bone, not a scrap of clothing, not a sign of Rachel or Daniel. For locals, the discovery reopened wounds they thought had scarred over. Some believed the lunchbox confirmed the drowning theory, that Rachel and Daniel had been lost to the water all along. Others were convinced it was staged, planted to distract from the truth of an abduction. The fact that no bodies surfaced only fed the divide. In diners and gas stations, old debates flared again. People spoke of the mystery with fresh urgency, their voices edged with the unease of realizing it might never be solved. The sheriff's office called the find a significant lead, but admitted it did not resolve the case. What it proved was simple. Rachel and Daniel had made it to the lake that day. What it failed to answer was the question everyone had asked since the first night. Where did they go after? In the end, the lunchbox became another artifact, sealed in an evidence locker alongside the sock, the blanket fragment, and a mountain of unanswered questions. 8 years had passed, and still the lake kept its silence. What it had given back was enough to stir the town again, but not enough to bring them home. The discovery of Daniel's lunchbox after 8 years forced the sheriff's office to do what many thought they never would: reopen the case. Files were pulled from dusty shelves, maps were unrolled, and investigators who had long since moved on were called back to offer fresh eyes. For the first time in years, Rachel and Daniel's names appeared in headlines again. But as detectives quickly realized, the lunchbox raised as many questions as it answered. The most obvious theory was the simplest, that the items had been lost in the lake during an accident. Perhaps Rachel and Daniel had been at the water's edge, the boy playing with his lunchbox when both had slipped. The box could have sunk, becoming lodged in silt until the drought exposed it years later. If that were true, then Rachel and Daniel's bodies might still lie in the cold depths, preserved but unrecoverable. Tahoe was known for keeping its dead, the frigid temperatures preventing natural decay. To some, the discovery confirmed what they had believed all along. This was a tragic drowning. But detectives couldn't shake the details that didn't fit. The condition of the items inside the box, better preserved than expected. The location, miles from where they were last seen. The possibility, however slim, that the lunchbox hadn't been dropped accidentally, but deliberately placed. If someone had abducted them, the box could have been tossed into the water later, a breadcrumb designed to point searchers back toward the lake instead of the forest. That possibility kept investigators from closing the book on abduction theories. They re-interviewed old witnesses, starting with the fisherman who years earlier had claimed to see Rachel with an unidentified man near the tree line. His story hadn't changed. He still insisted he saw someone, though details remained vague. When asked whether that man could have been carrying anything, he said he didn't notice. The hiker who once reported hearing a child's cry was also questioned again. Time hadn't sharpened his memory. It had only blurred it further. Rachel's estranged partner was once again pulled into the spotlight. 8 years earlier, detectives had cleared him, but in cold cases, suspicion has a way of circling back. He answered questions reluctantly, irritated that his life was being dragged into the mystery again. His alibi still held, confirmed by the same records and co-workers. But the family's fractured state made the interrogation sting. For some, his anger was proof of innocence. For others, it was exactly how guilt looked under pressure. Detectives also revisited Rachel's phone records, hoping technology had advanced enough to do what it couldn't years ago. They pored again over the cryptic texts sent to the prepaid number in the days leading up to the disappearance. But the trail remained dead. No new connections, no way to identify who she might have been planning to meet that day. Theories multiplied outside the investigation as well. In town, the lunchbox became a kind of Rorschach test. To some, it was closure. They had drowned, end of story. To others, it was confirmation of foul play, a staged clue meant to pacify suspicion. Fringe theories even suggested Rachel had left the lunchbox behind herself, a signal she intended to vanish but couldn't bring herself to do without leaving Daniel's mark behind. Detectives tried to cut through the noise by focusing on physical evidence, but there wasn't much. No DNA on the box besides Daniel's, no fingerprints, no sign of tampering. The sippy cup confirmed ownership, but revealed nothing about how long it had been in the lake. Every lead ended the same way it always had, at the edge of silence. The families who had once offered hope now seemed worn down by the return of the circus. Claire, Rachel's sister, told reporters she was grateful the box had been found, but begged people not to turn it into another wave of speculation. "It doesn't answer anything," she said. "It just reminds us of what we lost." Within the sheriff's office, some detectives argued for closing the case once more. They believed the drowning theory was the only one supported by evidence, however thin. Others pushed back, saying the sock and blanket found in the woods years earlier still contradicted that narrative. How could Daniel's belongings be miles from the lake if the tragedy had been confined to the water? Unless, of course, someone had moved them. It was this tug of war that defined the reopened investigation. Every theory seemed plausible in isolation, but none held together when placed against the full weight of the case. The lake suggested drowning. The forest suggested abduction. The texts suggested a meeting. The silence suggested nothing at all. In the end, the search teams once again packed up without answers. New divers found nothing, new interviews produced no breakthroughs, and the lunchbox joined the growing archive of artifacts that spoke of Rachel and Daniel, but refused to tell their story. 8 years had passed, and the town was right back where it had started, torn between possibilities, haunted by contradictions, and forced to admit the truth was still just out of reach. By the fall of that year, the drought had passed and the waters of Tahoe had begun to rise again, covering over the mudflats that had briefly exposed Daniel's lunchbox. Tourists returned to the beaches, the same laughter and sunburned afternoons that had always defined the lake. But for locals, the water never looked the same. The discovery had reopened the wound, and now the silence around Rachel and Daniel felt heavier than ever before. On a cool evening in October, the community gathered once more. The vigil was organized by Rachel's sister Claire, who had become the most vocal voice in keeping her memory alive. The crowd was smaller than it had been in the early years, but those who came carried candles and flowers, their faces drawn with the lines of age and grief. They stood at the shoreline near the cove where the lunchbox had been found, the place that had become the latest landmark in a story with too many markers and not enough meaning. Claire stepped forward with a small bouquet of wildflowers in her hands. She bent low, placing them carefully into the water, watching as the stems bobbed against the ripples. Her voice was quiet when she finally spoke, but those gathered leaned in to catch every word. "I still dream of them walking out of the trees," she said. "I see Rachel holding Daniel's hand, smiling, as if nothing ever happened. And then I wake up, and it's gone again." The words broke something in the crowd. Some cried openly, others bowed their heads in silence. For years they had speculated, argued, traded theories. But in that moment, there was no debate. Only the shared ache of not knowing. Officials had long since admitted what the family already knew, that the case was unresolved, the cause of disappearance undetermined. The sheriff's office could offer no closure, no final word to carry into the night. Instead, they offered the cold reassurance that the file remained open, ready for the day when new evidence might surface. But 8 years had passed, and faith in that promise was wearing thin. The lake itself seemed to bear the weight of the story. People who had grown up swimming in its clear blue water now admitted they felt uneasy standing on its banks. Some said it seemed darker, as though the surface reflected not just sky, but the secrets it had chosen to keep. Fishermen joked less, their voices quieter as they cast their lines. Hikers paused longer near the tree line, remembering whispers of a crying child, a shadowed figure. Parents clutched their children's hands more tightly on the trails, unwilling to let them drift too far ahead. Rachel and Daniel had become more than names in a case file. They had become a story the land itself seemed to carry. To some, they were a cautionary tale about the unpredictability of nature. To others, they were victims of human cruelty, their fate hidden by silence and fear. To everyone who lived around Tahoe, they were an open question that had changed the way the lake was seen forever. For Claire, the years had been marked not by milestones, but by absences. Daniel would have been 11 years old by now, running across soccer fields, trading jokes with classmates. Rachel would have been in her mid-30s, perhaps remarried, perhaps still finding her way as a single mother. Instead, they remained frozen in time, Rachel at 28, Daniel at 3. Every anniversary reminded her of what was stolen, not what was lived. Some nights, Claire said, she walked the shoreline alone. She would stand at the edge of the water, staring out into the blackness, and whisper her sister's name, just in case. Sometimes she thought she felt an echo, like the lake itself was listening. Other times, there was nothing but silence. Detectives who had once worked the case admitted quietly that it haunted them still. One retired investigator told a local paper that he sometimes drove out to the lake on quiet mornings, parking where Rachel's car had been found. He would sit there, staring at the same trees, the same trailhead, asking himself what he had missed. "It's the kind of case that never leaves you," he said, "because there should have been something, and there wasn't." Over the years, Tahoe collected new mysteries, new accidents, but none seemed to carry the same weight. The mother and child who vanished without a trace had become woven into the lore of the region. Their story was passed to new generations of hikers and campers as a kind of warning that even in daylight, even in the presence of others, people can vanish. What the lake revealed, the sock, the blanket, the lunchbox, was never enough. What it kept completely. No bodies, no confessions, no definitive truth, just fragments that led only to questions. On the night of the vigil, as the crowd began to disperse, Claire lingered by the water's edge. She looked out at the darkening surface, her reflection barely visible in the last light of day. Behind her, the candles flickered in the breeze, their glow faint against the vastness of the lake. She whispered something no one else could hear, then turned away, leaving the flowers drifting at the shore. To this day, locals say Tahoe feels different, heavy, as though beneath its beauty lies a silence too deep to disturb, a silence that belongs not just to the lake, but to Rachel and Daniel Moore, who walked into its shadow 8 years ago and never returned. And until the lake chooses to give up more than scraps, their story remains what it has always been, one of Tahoe's most haunting mysteries.